When Daniel first presented this idea to local agricultural experts, the response was not encouraging. Several told him directly that the physics simply didn't support it, that a fence, no matter how it was constructed, could not meaningfully alter water flow across dozens of acres of variable terrain. Others pointed out that, similar in a quiet farming valley, far from the reach of major highways or news cameras, a man named Daniel Whitfield spent 9 years of his life building something that almost everyone around him believed was impossible. Engineers told him it wouldn't hold. Agricultural experts told him it defied basic principles of land management, even his own family at times. I wondered if he had taken on a project that would consume the rest of his life without ever amounting to anything. What Daniel Whitfield built was, on the surface, just a fence. But what that fence represented, and what it eventually accomplished, would go on to change the way an entire region thought about farming, erosion, water conservation, and the relationship between human effort and the natural world. This is the story of that fence, the 9 years it took to build it, and why what happened next left even its harshest critics speechless. To understand why anyone would spend 9 years on something as seemingly ordinary as a fence, you have to understand the problem Daniel was trying to solve. The valley where he lived had once been fertile, productive land, passed down through generations of farmers. But decades of intensive agriculture, combined with increasingly erratic weather patterns, had taken a toll. Topsoil was washing away with every heavy rain. Groundwater levels were dropping. What had once been reliable farmland was becoming marginal, unpredictable, and in some areas, nearly unusable. Daniel had grown up on this land. He had watched his father struggle with the same declining yields, the same unpredictable harvests, the same sense that the land itself was slipping away, year after year, no matter how hard anyone worked it. By the time Daniel inherited the farm, he had already spent years thinking about the problem, not just how to survive it, but how to actually reverse it. Most of his neighbors had accepted the situation as inevitable. Some had sold their land to larger agricultural operations that could absorb the losses through sheer scale. Others had simply resigned themselves to smaller harvests and tighter margins each year. But Daniel had a different idea, one he had been developing for years before he ever picked up a shovel. He believed the answer wasn't in new equipment, new chemicals, or new crop varieties. He believed the answer was in water, specifically in how water moved across the land and how a carefully designed barrier could change that movement entirely. The idea itself wasn't entirely new. Daniel had read about ancient water management techniques used in arid regions around the world, methods for slowing down water as it moved across land, allowing it to soak in rather than run off, capturing moisture that would otherwise be lost within hours of a rainstorm. But applying these principles at the scale of his own farm, lying across dozens of acres of uneven terrain, was something no one in his region had ever attempted. His plan was to build what he called a living contour fence, a structure that would follow the natural elevation lines of his land, slowing the flow of water during heavy rains, allowing sediment and moisture to settle rather than wash away, and gradually rebuilding the soil itself over time. Unlike a conventional fence, which exists simply to mark boundaries or contain livestock, this fence would be an active tool for reshaping the land's relationship with water. Projects attempted elsewhere had failed, either from structural collapse during heavy storms or from the sheer scale of ongoing maintenance required. A few suggested, more bluntly, that he was wasting time and money on a fantasy, and that his resources would be better spent on conventional erosion control methods that had at least some track record of success. Daniel listened to all of this, and then he started building anyway. The first year was almost entirely trial and error. Daniel had no formal engineering background, no construction crew, and no substantial budget. What he had was an intimate, decades-long knowledge of every rise and fall of his land, and an almost stubborn refusal to accept that the problem was unsolvable. He began by walking his property for weeks, marking natural contour lines with stakes, watching where water pooled after rainstorms, and noting where it moved fastest and caused the most damage. This alone took months longer than he had expected, because he refused to rely on approximate measurements. He wanted the fence to follow the land's actual behavior, not a theoretical model of it. Once he had mapped the contours to his satisfaction, he began constructing the first sections of the fence by hand, using a combination of locally sourced timber, stone, and densely packed vegetation designed to slow water without blocking it entirely. The design needed to be permeable enough to avoid catastrophic failure during heavy storms, but dense enough to meaningfully reduce the speed of water moving downhill. The early results were discouraging. Several of his first attempts washed out completely during the first serious rains of that first year, undoing months of work in a matter of hours. Neighbors who had been skeptical from the beginning felt their doubts confirmed. A few even stopped by, not out of encouragement, but out of what Daniel later described as a kind of resigned curiosity, checking in to see how badly the project had failed this time. But Daniel didn't stop. Each failure taught him something specific about how water moved across his particular stretch of land, information no textbook or expert consultation could have given him, because it was unique to the exact contours, soil composition, and rainfall patterns of his farm. He adjusted his designs, experimented with different materials, and slowly, section by section, began to see sections of the fence hold through increasingly severe weather. By the third year, something began to shift, though it was still far too early to call it success. The sections of fence that had survived multiple rainy seasons were visibly changing the land around them. Water that had once rushed straight downhill, carrying topsoil with it, was now pooling gently behind sections of the fence, soaking into the ground instead of running off. Grass and native vegetation, which had struggled to establish itself in the eroded soil for years, began growing more densely in these areas. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of transformation that would show up in a single dramatic before and after photograph. It was slow, incremental, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking closely. But Daniel was looking closely every single day, and he could see that something was working, even if it was working far more slowly than he had originally hoped. The years that followed were a mixture of steady progress and ongoing setbacks. Severe storms in the 5th year destroyed nearly a quarter of the fence he had built up to that point, forcing him to rebuild sections he thought had been finished. A prolonged drought in the 6th year raised questions about whether the entire project even mattered if there wasn't enough rain to manage in the first place. There were moments, Daniel later admitted, when he seriously considered abandoning the project entirely, not because he had lost faith in the underlying idea, but because the sheer physical and financial toll of 9 years of continuous labor had become difficult to sustain. What kept him going, he has said, wasn't blind optimism. It was the accumulating evidence, season after season, that the sections of fence that held were making a measurable difference, not just in how the land looked, but in actual crop yields on the fields protected by it. By the 8th year, the transformation had become impossible to ignore, even for the fence's harshest critics. The fields protected by the completed sections of the contour fence were producing yields significantly higher than comparable unprotected fields nearby, even during years of below-average rainfall. Soil samples taken from these areas showed measurably higher organic content and moisture retention compared to soil from untreated sections of the property. Word began to spread beyond Daniel's immediate neighbors. Agricultural researchers, who had once dismissed his approach, began requesting visits to study what he had built. Some of the same experts who had told him 9 years earlier that his plan defied basic principles of water management returned to walk the same land and found themselves reconsidering their earlier assessments in light of what they were now seeing with their own eyes. By the end of the 9th year, Daniel had completed the full contour fence system across his property, an intricate network of barriers precisely calibrated to the unique topography of his land, built almost entirely through his own labor, trial, and persistence. The results, once fully measured, were striking. Erosion on his property had been reduced dramatically, groundwater levels beneath his fields had risen measurably compared to surrounding farms, and his overall crop yields had not only stabilized, but had begun to exceed what the land had produced even in its most productive years, decades earlier, before the long decline had begun. What happened next surprised almost everyone, including Daniel himself. Agricultural extension programs in the region began studying his methods formally, documenting the specific techniques he had developed through nearly a decade of hands-on experimentation. Some of the very experts who had originally dismissed the project began incorporating elements of his approach into broader erosion control recommendations for farmers across similar terrain. What had once been considered an eccentric and likely doomed personal project became, within a few years, a case study referenced in discussions about sustainable, low-cost water management for smallholder farms. Neighboring farmers who had watched Daniel's project with skepticism for the better part of a decade began approaching him for advice on their own land. A man who had once been quietly regarded as stubborn, even a little foolish for pouring years of labor into something experts insisted couldn't work, found himself instead being sought out as a source of hard-won, practical knowledge that no formal expert had been able to offer. Perhaps, most remarkably, the broader ecological effects of the fence extended beyond Daniel's own property. As groundwater levels in the immediate area began to stabilize and even rise, some of the benefits started to extend to neighboring farms as well, particularly those downhill from his land. Anu found their own soil gradually improving as the water table beneath the entire area responded to the changes Daniel had spent nearly a decade putting into place. Looking back on the 9 years it took to build something so many people told him was impossible, Daniel has been notably measured in how he talks about the experience. He doesn't describe it as a triumphant story of proving the experts wrong, though there is certainly an element of that in what happened. Instead, he tends to describe it as a long process of listening to the land itself, to the patterns of water and soil that had been trying to tell him something for years before he ever picked up a single fence post. He has said that the biggest lesson from those 9 years wasn't really about fences or erosion or agricultural technique at all. It was about the value of sustained patient attention to a problem that most people, understandably, don't have the time, resources, or willingness to sit with for as long as it takes to actually understand it. Experts, he has pointed out, weren't necessarily wrong about the general principles they were working from. They simply hadn't spent 9 years walking the same acres of land, watching how water moved across it after every single rainstorm, adjusting their understanding inch by inch until the solution finally, slowly, became clear. There's something worth reflecting on in this story beyond its specific details about fences and farmland. It's a reminder that some of the most meaningful solutions to difficult problems don't come from dramatic breakthroughs or sudden flashes of insight. They come from years of unglamorous, incremental effort, showing up again and again, adjusting course after each failure, refusing to abandon a problem simply because the timeline for solving it is longer than anyone would prefer. Daniel Whitfield's fence still stands today, a quiet, unassuming structure that most outsiders would walk past without giving it a second glance. But to those who understand what it took to build and what it ultimately accomplished, it stands as a reminder that sometimes the things experts say could never work simply haven't been tried by someone willing to spend 9 years finding out.